Hello and welcome everyone to week 4's lecture. This is Advanced CSS Part 2. This is going to cover Chapter 7, Part 7.5 to 7.6. It's going to be not as long of a lecture, hopefully, as last week's lecture, but here we go. If we remember last week, we were talking about CSS effects and preprocessors being this week. So that's what we're going to go over. So CSS effects are very cool things. Think of it like if you've taken the video class, they're things that add that little, star wipe wonderful effect to your CSS. To your web page. There are more effects than just these 4. However, these are the most popular. Those are transformations, filters, transitions, and animations. So transformations. Transformations are moving things from one place to another. I apologize that it went off the little bit on the slide, but is what is, right? So CSS transforms, they change the size, position, shape of an HTML element. So rotate is going to be one way to change position, so is transform. Skew is going to be one way to change shape, and so is scale. So in here we have different transforms, right? So we've got our default image over on the right of Emirates Stadium, and then we've applied different effects to it. So the first one down is its transform rotate 45 degrees. Now notice that it is rotating everything within that container because it's set at the figure level. But it's rotating 45 degrees. And it is always going to go towards the right unless you go negative, and then it's going to go towards the left. The next one down is a skew. So it is taking that, basically it figures out where the bottom left element is and the top left element, and it skews that top left 20 degrees. If that makes sense. Same kind of thing that it does in Photoshop or in Illustrator. So it just is skewing it. I don't know a better word for it. I'm sorry. The next is transform. Now notice that this is just affecting the image, because in the CSS to the right, it's saying, if it is a figure, an image within a figure, do this. So the way that you move stuff is you translate it along the x-axis or the y-axis. So x-axis left to right, y-axis up and down. And then notice also here that we have a positive and a negative value. So it's saying translate it on the x-axis 100 pixels. So it's going to move it to the right 100 pixels, left to right. And then translate it on the y-axis, which is up and down, negative 30 pixels. So instead of going up, it's going down negative 30 pixels. So you can use those negative values to affect the opposite of the default. Then the last one is showing that you can combine them. So what we've done here is it's transformed the whole container, the figure, rotate it 15 degrees, and then it's taken the image and said, hey, I need you to rotate it 45 degrees, but I also need you to scale it down by 0.5. So it's half the size. Okay? So the scale of 1 is 100%. Anything below that, so anything into your decimals, is smaller, and anything above that is bigger. You can also transport or transform things in a 3D space by using perspective, rotate 3D, scale 3D, and translate 3D. If you want to learn about those, I would recommend, I'll put some sources up on the on the canvas about it that links to those kind of things. But it's really cool what you can do in 3D space on there, because before it was a flat canvas, right? You think about when you're painting an image, you have a flat canvas, but now it's a three-dimensional canvas. Filters. So I don't know what is going on here with this. Okay, it is just covering up that listing 7.4, so ignore that. Okay, biggerize this, and then we'll get back to it. Oop. Transforms, filters. Okay, so filters allow you to change an image without changing the base image, right? Think of it like a filter in Photoshop or Illustrator or GIMP or whatever image editing software you use. So there are a bunch of different ways to use filters, and there are a bunch of different filters. So again, I'm going to put up some resources on the canvas for the different ways to use it. But here are just some of the examples. So original is on the top left. Next is it's saturating it, so make it more saturated. So saturate of 3. Next one is grayscale, so how black and white do you want it? Next one is contrast, so how much contrast between the lightest part and the darkest part do you want? Same thing with brightness. You can also blur, you can invert, you can add a sepia tone. You can also rotate the hues by 90 degrees. It's hard to see it here, but basically if you think about your color wheel, it's going to shift that color wheel. And then opacity is how much see-through it is. And then the last two are just showing you that you can like 100% put more than one together. Okay? So the CSS is showing how the blue box that's off the blue box. So the sum image, you're just using one filter, but you can use multiple filters. You can, so that last example, setting a blur of 5 pixels, hue rotate of 60 degrees, and a saturate of 2. It's worth noting that hue rotate 180 degrees is going to swap those values on the color wheel, but it is not the same as invert. So think about that. If you want to know more about color theory, we have a lot of great art classes at KCC that can show you how those color harmonies and hues work. A little outside the scale of this class, though. Okay, so transitions. Transitions are something kind of new. So CSS3 is latest and greatest CSS, just like HTML5 is latest and greatest HTML at the moment. Transitions take an effect and then lengthen it over a length of time, which that is so cool, right? So let's say you've got, and I'm sure it'll show it, I put an example in here, but basically it adds an animation to it without adding an animation to it, because animations are a little more complicated and we'll go over that. But it's, if you took a rotate and added a transition to it, you could make that rotate over a period of time. So delay is how long before it starts. Duration is how long it starts or it lasts. The property is the property, what we're affecting with the transition. And then the timing is how many steps are in the transition. So let's look at this a little bit more concretely. Okay? So what we've got here is a static image, but it's showing you how the transition would apply. So you've got your normal button here on the left, and then we're adding a transition of, we're affecting the background color, we're having an effect over 0.5 of a second, so it's going to last half a second. And then the timing function, what's the rate of change on it? So ease in and ease out means that, like, so if it's easing in, it's going to slow down when it's coming in. And then if it's easing out, it's going to slow down when it comes out. So those are what those graphs are on the far right. And then how much of a delay? So do we want it to start immediately? So we have a delay of 0 seconds. If we wanted it to start after 5 seconds, we'd have a transition delay of 0 seconds. So basically it's going to go from this dark green to this lighter green. And it happens when it's hovered over. Okay? When the mouse is not hovered over, it will be that background, that darker background color. But when it's hovered over, it's going to transition to that lighter one. Now notice that the transition is set in the main button, but does not do anything until it has a new value to transition to. That's why the button hover is set. Otherwise, if you have the other background color in it, it's just going to over and over change color, which is fine. So transitions, remember we have the property that's being affected, so it's going to change background color. Duration, timing, which is going to be either linear, which means that it's same all the way through, ease out, which means it slowed down toward the end, or ease in, slows down toward the front. And then how long do we want to delay the start of it? So transition delay. So those are your basics of how you can make a transition. Here is, if you've ever wondered how you get that handy, like, nice little animation when you're sliding out a menu, this is how it's doing it. So it's using a transition on the menu to ease it in and ease it out. Or sorry, to do that sliding kind of, I hate to use the word animation because we're going to be going over animations, but it's making that slide out when it becomes visible. So the menu on this one is initially hidden. And the way that they've done that is not by putting a display none on there. Remember, we can hide things by putting display none. What they've done instead is something really clever. They have made it an absolute position and set that position absolutely 210 pixels to the left of where the browser window starts. So that's what the negative 210 pixels is. It's saying take that leftmost side and then go over to the left of that further 210 pixels and make it stick. No matter what, it's not going to move. It's going to be absolutely positioned. And then when it's hovered over, so when they move along that left edge of the element, that's when that transition is going to happen. And it's going to move it to the left until it gets to position 0 on the left. And it's going to take 0.6 of a second, so 0.6 seconds, 60th of a second. And then ease out, which means that it's going to slow down towards the end. Now, this is why it's important that you are familiar with absolute positioning, because they had to know exactly how wide that menu is to get it positioned in the way to where it slides out and where it needs to. And then the last little bit is saying that when it's not hovering, we're going to slide it back to the left to its original position. And then it's going to be ease out, so again, it's going to slow down towards the end. Okay, animations. Bet you didn't know that you could animate with CSS. Well, you can. If you are familiar with animation in any sort of function outside of web development, some of these terms are going to make sense to you. If not, you're going to see some new terminology. Okay. So it's like a transition. It's got a start state and an end state. But you can control the steps in between it. So it's done through keyframes, right? Also, animations begin once it's defined. So once it loads, it's going to start that animation. So, and then it can repeat, so it can loop. So we've got here in the examples on the right, a transition. We've got, begin state, end state, one to the other. You cannot affect it in between those two. And then an animation, you've got a begin state, end state, but you've got like 4 steps in between. And those 4 steps, those little squares in there, are keyframes. So key points, going back to animation terminology, those frames, because you would have slight sidebar. Most animation is 24 frames a second. That means that for each second of cartoon or whatever that you see, there are 24 different images that play in that second sequentially. So that's where the keyframes come from. Okay. Animation example. It is really hard to show an animation example in a PowerPoint presentation. So this is going to be one of those things that I, again, put as an example in Canvas. But what you would have is a class that's saying that you have as animated. So you define a class, and then you define the animation itself within your CSS. So here are the different parts of it. We're going to break it down. Okay? We are going to create an animation named animated. It is going to iterate infinitely, so it is never going to stop. This is where you would set your loops. So if you have an iteration count 1, it plays once and is done. Twice, or 2, twice done. Infinite, forever. The animation name, so this is where you actually define the animation. And then it's got a play state, so play it once it's defined. How the animation duration is, again, like the transition duration. It's how long does the whole thing take. And then, we have the timing function again. You have linear, ease out, and ease in, and then delay of 1 second. So this should look kind of familiar, right? And then animation play state stop. So animation play state paused is really helpful for debugging. It's basically going to stop the animation when you're hovering over it. Okay, here's what we're going to do, since it's not super great for showing that biz on a PowerPoint. I've got here our W3 Schools example. So what we have here is a div. You'll notice in this that it is not inline style, but it's in the page style versus having a separate CSS. So it's saying if there's a div, make it a height of 100, width of 100, make the background color red. We're going to apply an animation name of example, and then an animation duration. It's going to take 4 seconds. So important to note here that you do not need all of the things in there, because before we had the duration, yes, name, yes, but there were also things like timing function and play state and iteration count. You don't necessarily need all of those things. Okay? Why did you go back? Okay, so let's bring up that again, and we're going to run it. So note your default, your animation state is going to be running. Your iteration is 1, and your delay is 0. Those are defaults. And then we've set up our keyframes here. So like I said, you have to set up your frames to tell it what to do and what to do when. So at the start, setting that background color to red, and then at 25% of the duration, so at 1 second, because we have a duration of 4 seconds, it's going to set it to yellow. And then at half the duration, it's going to set it to blue. And then 100%, it's going to set it to green. Okay, so I'm going to run it again. There we go. Goes back to its original style when finished, because it only has an iteration of 1. Now, let's see. If I can spell. Iteration. I never remember what it's. There it is. Iteration count infinite. And then we're going to run it again. So now it runs and runs and runs and runs forever. Okay. So what I'm gonna pull it up is basically this handy dandy thing of animations here, and then also the transitions with the 3D and 2D transforms, because like we had said, you can transform it into a 3D space. So that's translating along the z-axis, and that's translating along the x-axis. I don't know why it is so hard for me to remember those, but it's what it is. Okay. Bear with me. I think it's funny that I can do all of this like web development stuff, but PowerPoint, man, it just gets me every time. Okay, CSS preprocessors. These are super cool. These are super, super cool. Because before this, you couldn't do things like variables. So a variable is where you like declare a thing and then set it to another thing, and then you can use that thing over and over and over and over and over without having to rewrite it. So imagine if you have a main color on your website, and before, every time you wanted to use that main color, you had to remember the hex code. Bummer, right? Well, now with variables, you can set a variable of main color, set it in there, and then you don't have to remember that hex code, you just have to remember the variable name. You can also do a bunch of other stuff with it. That's a very, like, simple example. There was no encapsulation. There was no scoping. So, you couldn't... There are some ways you could affect, like, a parent-child relationship. You can use things like pseudo classes to affect childs of your parent container, but you can really do cool things with inheritance here. You can also do calculations. So calculations and functions. So math you can do, and then functions are kind of pseudo scripting, right? It allows you to take your CSS and Lego it so that it's modular and you can take it apart and you can move things. And I know I'm nerding out on it, but it's really, really cool. That's what CSS preprocessors do. It's basically processing before the processing. So you can use variables, you can use nesting, you can use functions, you can use inheritance. This handles duplication, and you don't have to copy and paste so many times. Okay. The way that preprocessors work is that you have a compiler, which is a GUI, which is a graphical user interface or command line tool. And I know that sounds big and scary, but it's really not. So what it does is it takes the SAS files, which are your pre-processing files, takes them, and then outputs your CSS. So if you've done any sort of programming before, this is just a compiler, right? You've got your pre-processed files that are written in a way that's very different than your output files. That's what SAS does. This is how you declare variables in SAS. Okay? So we have a variable here of primary color, and we've set that to a hex code of 647 ACB. And then we have a variable here called spacing, and we've set that to 20 pixels. So now, anytime that we want to reference that primary color in there, we reference it in our declaration. And the declarations are basically just like CSS. So, before, and I'm going to use KCC's hex code as an example, but anytime I had that main color in there, I would have to do a search and replace for pound 820024, because that's our hex code. Now, with this, I can go to the preprocessor and change, set everything to the primary color, and I don't have to do a find and replace. And if I want to change that primary color to whatever, I only have to change it the one time. Okay. There's also nesting. So in your book, there are some better examples of this. But the cool thing about this is that it allows you to really narrow your scope. Okay? So in this, we have a container, and within that container we have a sidebar, and within that sidebar we have an H2. So within the container, within the sidebar, we're setting that to red, all of them, and then within that we're setting that to color. But if there's a container with a sidebar with an H2 in it, then it's going to be set to side color. And then same thing with main. So you can really get super granular in there with what you're affecting. Okay. So this is cool because it shows you how it compiles. Okay? So once your CSS is compiled, it is regular CSS. So you would need to rechange the file and then recompile if you're wanting to use those variables and stuff. Because look at the example here. We've set mid-neutral to this hex code, and then shadow to a, it's a border, what they've done, basically. No, they've set the variable of what they're going to set the box shadow to. That's what they've done. Okay. And then they've set a mix-in. So, mix-ins act like a function that return a style. And I know that sounds confusing, but it's just a more advanced way of setting of multiple variables. Variable can only be one thing, right? Variable, one thing. Mix-in, function can be all things. So we have our variable, which is the one thing, the hex code, or that value of your whatever your box shadow is going to be. But your mix-in is a border and a margin and a box shadow. And yes, use those variables in there, but it basically sets up that declaration that you can use again and again and again. So we add that to box, and then we include it in feature. And then when it compiles, it's going to show what's in the blue box there. So instead of having to write that out over and over, it puts those in. Okay. So, your lab this week is one of the in-chapter exercises. We're getting a little bit more into advanced stuff here, so make sure to read 7.5 and 7.6. Again, we have our lovely help discussions on the on the Canvas. I will put up all of the resource links to the things like transitions and transforms. And then I'll also put up some information on SAS, so our compilers. So CSS, which is SAS CSS, and then those preprocessors. We won't really be working with them too terrible much because it's a little bit outside the scope of this class, but I want you to know about them and know how powerful they are, because they are really, really cool. They're also, once you are starting to look for a job, having a basic knowledge of these will get you in a lot more places. So if somebody asks if you know SAS, yeah, I know SAS. And this is, again, different than software as a service, which is SaaS, the CSS SAS. Yes, I know how to do preprocessors. Okay. Have a great rest of your week, and yeah, I'll see you next week.